May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Luke's gospel, more than any of the others, has a focus. And the focus is on the outsider, on the marginalized. Luke writes a lot about women in his gospel, which was not typically the norm during the first century in Palestine. Luke has a very strong concern for the poor and the marginalized. So it's not uncommon, or it wouldn't be weird to think that Luke would include a parable about a rich man and call him a fool. That's the way that this passage is titled in my Bible, the parable of the rich fool. Let's take a look at that passage a little bit closer and see what we can learn from it. The passage starts with, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Now, during the first century in a Jewish community, if there was an estate to be divided, it was spelled out pretty specifically how that was to be done. The oldest son would get a double portion of the inheritance. So if it was two brothers, as it appears to be in this case, the older brother would get 2/3 of the estate, and the younger brother would get 1/3. It also wasn't uncommon at the time, if there was a dispute amongst inheritors, to take it to a rabbi, a learned person, to be the arbiter. So this situation that we see in Luke's gospel this morning is not uncommon during this period. But what Jesus does in this situation is what Jesus tends to do when confronted with questions of earthly kinds of problems. Jesus doesn't answer this question directly, this question of inheritance. Jesus gets to the root of the matter. Jesus goes deeper than the actual question. What would motivate one of these sons to demand a larger portion of the inheritance than what was deserved? Greed. Greed is at the root of this entire passage. We see it demonstrated by the younger brother who comes to Jesus to ask for him to settle this dispute. We see it in the parable that Jesus uses to teach the younger brother about how not to act. Jesus in the parable tells of this rich man who had a large crop one particular year. In the first century, that would mean that this individual farmer pretty much controlled the market. He would be able to set prices. He could employ others. He could do whatever he wished with this crop. And he would be a very important and influential person. The parable goes, the land of the rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, what should I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all of my grain for my goods. The issue at the root of this greed is self-absorption. This rich farmer thought only of himself. This rich farmer considered no other relationships in this scenario. He didn't think of God. He didn't think of his neighbor. He didn't think of anybody else other than himself. A couple of weeks ago, you may recall that I preached on the sermon of the Good Samaritan, and I quoted a New Testament scholar named Amy Jill Levine. Dr. Levine says that religion in general, and the parables in particular, are intended to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I think that's absolutely true. And if that is true, how does this parable afflict the comfortable? I dare say none of us in this room would consider ourselves greedy. We certainly wouldn't call anyone in this room greedy. So if none of us identify or could be challenged with being greedy, how does this convict us? What do we need to get out of this parable for it to have any lasting effect or implication? It's the idea of the self-centeredness behind the greed. While we may not be greedy in our possessions, while we may not be greedy in our striving for power and authority, while we may not be greedy when it comes to the food that we have, we all have a tendency to put ourselves at the center of our own stories. St. Augustine of Hippo, the 4th century bishop and theologian, writes that true virtue is an ordering of your love. If we love God first, love neighbor second, everything else will fall into place. The mistake that the rich landowner made in this parable wasn't storing up for a rainy day. This parable doesn't convict wealth in and of itself. This parable convicts. This parable challenges us when we put ourselves at the center. When we think of ourselves before we think of God, before we think of our neighbor. That's where the true challenge of this parable comes in. Think how the parable might have been different if the rich landowner had thought about giving back to God that which God had bestowed on him. Think of how the parable might have been different if the rich landowner had thought about how to care for everybody else in the community before he decided to eat, drink, and be merry. Sisters and brothers, this parable challenges us to take ourselves out of the center of our stories. This parable challenges us to put God first, neighbor second, and our own interests last. Because if we can do that, we will never be called a fool.
Amen.
Amen. Please stand as you're able and let's affirm our faith in the word